But there is 10 years' work there. 10 years of my life, sir. Surely 50 pounds is...
Am I not correct in thinking that you have never had any of your work published, Professor Petrie?
I first met Herbert Lom at a party. My old agent, Irene Robinson, her partner at the agency represented Herbert Lom and a lot of actors from overseas. And they were having kind of a cocktail party. Herbert was in town, he was going. And she invited me and told me he was going to be there. And oh my gosh, this poor man, I was the unequivocal drooling idiot. Fanboy, but he was so nice, and he sat down and we had drinks, and we just ended up sitting in the corner of the party and talking just the entire evening away. And he got very interested in what I was writing and the fact that Irene represented me as a screenwriter, and he told me he was working on a novel, and he asked me if I would mind helping out and read what he was writing and give him notes and kind of act as an adjunct editor to it. Herbert Lom was just he was the greatest guy because he was so unpretentious and he was funny and he had such a wry sense of humor, but he was also just could be gloriously silly. And I admit, yes, I did. I asked him on more than a few occasions to do his Inspector Dreyfus face, and he absolutely, he'd always do it. And he was wonderful that way. You know, he had had such an interesting life as an actor in Czechoslovakia and then having to leave at the dawn of World War II, making his way to England. And in fact, because people would later question why he and so many actors would work on pictures produced by somebody like Harry Alan Towers, for example. And he knew Harry Alan Towers during World War II because Harry was producing these broadcasts for the British Army that Herbert was recording, and these were supposed to be interceptions from the Czech underground, and they were filled with misinformation. And then they were sent out and rebroadcast so the Nazis would hear them and move their troops according to what they thought the Czechs were doing along their borders. And Harry Alan Towers was the producer of those broadcasts. That's how he and Herbert first met. Herbert always said that very early on, because he had an accent, he was always going to be cast as a villain. And in fact, that was one of the reasons he loved Hell Drivers so much, because there was an opportunity for him actually to not play the bad guy for a chance. But when you see something like The Lady Killers and the Ealing pictures that he did early on, and he is so wonderful in those movies, but he had the dark complexion, he had those piercing eyes, and that deep, deep voice. So of course they wanted him as either an authority figure or someone who was trying to do someone ill will or take over the world or whatever it was that he was going to do. I just thought he was absolutely magnetic. And we talked so many times about Mysterious Island and his performance as Captain Nemo, which I just think is tremendous. He was very modest about really practically all of his accomplishments, really. But he loved doing that because also not only he and James Mason, of course, had done a very early film together in the early 40s, but he was taking over for Mason and adding something different than James Mason did in the Disney classic version of 20,000 Leagues. And to me, Herbert always felt closer to Jules Verne, not only because they not only darkened his skin, but just his presence, to me, felt more, I don't know, worldly or authoritarian or something, and not quite as, if you will, pitiable, ultimately, that Mason became because he had lost faith in mankind. Maybe that was the difference. James Mason loses faith in mankind. Herbert Lom was disappointed by mankind. And I think there's a distinction there, and I liked Herbert Lom's approach better.
Young woman, you must come with me.
When I would ask Herbert about the Phantom, and we talked about it multiple times, he was always amazed and amused and actually gratified because he had been there when it was released and it did not shake the world the way it was supposed to for Hammer or for Universal. Of course, it kind of derailed Terence Fisher's career for a while, and the film did not meet all the heightened expectations. Of course, there was also all the history behind it, which, of course, Herbert knew about, rumors about Cary Grant and all of that stuff, and who he knew. So he was very delighted that it came back, and of course, even more delighted when he was able to use it in The Pink Panther and take advantage of that with Blake Edwards. And there he was just having so much fun with it. Again, because at the time that it was done and then when it was released, it was considered a failure. And so there was this bit of resurrection from the ashes to the project. And I think he's wonderful in the movie. And you have so much sympathy for him. And particularly, oh my God, the way he gets treated, and, you know, tomato, tomato, tomato. Oh my God, Michael Gough just, it's just wonderful.
Thank you.
He's terrific in the movie, and he always took that with a bit of a grain of salt. He says, "Hey, well, thank you, but you know, it is what it is." You know, but more and more people recognized him for that performance and complimented him on it, and he was always just so taken aback that it would be Phantom of the Opera, that it was not Spartacus, that it wasn't some of these gigantic other films that he was in around the same time.
I am going to teach you to sing, Christine. I am going to give you a new voice. A voice so wonderful that theaters all over the world will be filled with your admirers.
I think Herbert was cast absolutely because of his voice. Also, he had prestige because of films like Spartacus and The Lady Killers. He had a very successful British television series, The Human Jungle. Of course, that was Hammer's measuring stick for Peter Cushing back in the 50s. He was somebody who brought, if you will, a different presence than other Hammer leading men. I think that if they had used Christopher Lee, for example, it wouldn't have had the same impact, or in fact, it might have just been classified, oh, here comes another Hammer production starring Christopher Lee. And you won't find a bigger fan of Christopher Lee than me, but I think they wanted to try and go down a different pathway.
And when you sing, Christine, you will be singing only for me.
I think that all those great advantages of having Herbert Lom play the role also ended up being one of the disadvantages, because the film then did not fit into the quote-unquote classic category. Even though the film cost money and you know, they put so much into it, still it was considered, if you will, kind of a red-headed stepchild of Hammer films.
Let her sleep.
We actually talked about the mask and everything at one time. First of all, he thought the design was wonderful, which it is, because it's scary in itself. And in some ways, I think the mask itself is scarier than the actual deformity makeup with the acid burns. But I know one thing that he really pressed on Ashton, and Ashton agreed with him, is he wanted the rot of the sewer, because he's like decaying down there himself, just like his life is crumbling, he is crumbling, the sewer itself, of course, is falling apart, and he wanted that to be part of his wardrobe and part of his presence. His hair is crumbling and it's gray and it's falling apart and he's shedding. He wanted that deterioration to be as much a part of the character and his physical appearance as his acting. Actually, Herbert told me that his only reservation when they offered it to him was Claude Rains' performance, because he loved Claude Rains. He had worked with him and they were friends. And he felt a little, I think, unease about stepping in, because, of course, the Lom Phantom follows very much the story pattern of the Arthur Lubin Phantom from '43. And that, rather than the Chaney film, I think Herbert was a little, I think he just did feel a little uncomfortable. He didn't want anyone not only to compare him unfavorably to his old friend, but he did not want to, if you will, cast a shadow on his old friend either. And I don't think he does, because again, his approach certainly to the physicality of the character is completely different than Rains. Because Claude Rains is dressed to the nines and absolutely gorgeous, and it doesn't matter if he's slogging through the sewers or whatever it is he's doing. Boy, he is sharp as a razor all the time. And that is not the Herbert Lom Phantom.
Use your voice from here.
I think the thing was with Herbert, he kind of had these parallel careers, and he loved to work, and he was paid very well, and he lived very well. So he had kind of the Harry Alan Towers strain of films. And there, that was just like these gorgeous holidays of going to Spain or wherever it was. And he'd say, oh my God, Jess Franco knows every head waiter in the world. So they would go off and just make these films. And he said half the time he was doing his dialogue to a coat hanger. And he just loved it. And then they would go to these jazz clubs and just have an absolute ball. But then there was the Pink Panther. And that was, of course, I mean, the money paid and the prestige and the glamour and everything else behind those movies was so enormous. And then also, too, he would make himself available. Of course, he did films for Amicus. He loved doing Asylum. And in fact, he said he was so startled when he saw the tiny robot of himself. He said it was terrifying when he saw it. And he loved doing that. We never really discussed And Now the Screaming Starts, but he was very lucky, because if he was in, say, an independent movie or a horror film for so many weeks at this time, then the next thing you know, he was in Nice or some extraordinary place for Blake Edwards for 4 months. And that pattern continued through his entire career.
Before I go, I implore you, allow me to finish one thing. Let me teach you to use that wonderful voice that God has given you. Then you may never see me again, but you will never forget.
We just had so much fun, because with all of these things, and we're talking about these classic movies and this just great work he did, he was just this unpretentious man. And when we were working on the novel, oh, and there it is, Dr. Guillotine, and he would send me pages, and I would do the notes, and he was doing beautifully. And I'm very pleased. He actually took some of my suggestions, and he would come to Los Angeles, usually staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Ring, ring, and I'd get that phone call. Corte, are you ready to go to work? And I'd say, yes, sir, I am. And I'd shoot over there. And of course, work was this just fantastic dinner and sitting in the polo lounge and drinks and everything. And it was just so much fun. And he was just a spectacularly good guy, and with very little ego. And I did an interview with him for Fangoria. I still remember this because he wanted to repeat it, because we talked about so many things. But I think the only time he ever really got annoyed when he was making a movie was I don't know what the film was, but the director made a comment to him, okay, Herbert, do your best because you're being paid a lot of money for this. And that got him upset, because he said unequivocally, it did not matter whatever the budget was, whatever the project was, if he had signed on for it, he was absolutely going to do his best. He was not going to slough anything off. And I think that says everything about him, because that's the kind of guy he was.
Who are you? Answer me, who are you?
Good evening, Lord Ambrose.
I think Herbert Lom's Phantom ranks right up to the top, because his performance is so magnetic, because it elicits so much sympathy. And of course, that voice just cannot be equaled by Robert Englund or whoever it is. It's hypnotizing. And that is what makes all the difference. That young woman And you're just carried with it. You understand why she's terrified, and you understand also why Heather Sears is drawn to it, because who wouldn't be?